Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak at today's seminar. I'm going to be talking about frameworks and tools to support informed substitution, drawing off of more than 20 years of experience working with governments, industry, and academics on tools and processes to support the adoption of safer chemicals and materials and products. First of all, let's recap what alternatives assessment is. Alternatives assessment is a process for identifying, comparing, and selecting safer alternatives to chemicals of concern. Alternatives assessment compares these alternatives to the chemical of concern or priority chemical based on hazard, exposure, performance, and economic viability. Ultimately, alternatives assessment is a tool to support informed substitution or the thoughtful transition from a chemical of high concern to chemicals or non-chemical options of lower concern, considering the trade-offs that are in the process and the available information. Alternatives assessment starts with thinking about the function of the chemical, not the particular chemical. Even though a regulatory process may prohibit or restrict, or a market may restrict that chemical, it's the function that we're trying to replace, not the particular chemical. When we think about function, we consider whether that function is necessary in a particular product, for example, water repellency or flame retardancy. In doing that, we can consider necessariness, but we can also consider whether there are non-chemical options to meet that functional need, or whether that functional need may be overprescribed for that particular application. When we do alternatives assessment, we try to reduce the intrinsic impacts of our chemical choices, lower hazard and lower exposure potential. We try to reduce those because in the event of a mistake, the trade-offs are less. We focus on affordability and effectiveness as well. And that doesn't end when the assessment is over. One thing is to identify and evaluate alternatives. Another thing is really to adopt them. So adoption processes often can lead to their own potential unintended consequences. So we want to make sure that we support the adoption process to ensure that the alternatives actually do work in practice and they are safer. And when those alternatives don't exist, we need to invest in research and development to design the newer alternatives. There are multiple steps in the alternatives assessment process, and I'm going to go through a couple of those right now, but focus more specifically on the hazard assessment part of an alternatives assessment. A typical alternatives assessment mainly considers hazard, comparative exposure, technical feasibility, and economic feasibility. The other steps here add additional information to inform and improve the decision-making process. For example, scoping is where we establish the decision rules and the priorities for the assessment and maybe screen out potential alternatives. We identify alternatives, we assess their hazards, we characterize their exposures, we evaluate their technical feasibility and economic feasibility, and we may consider their other life cycle considerations, for example, trade-offs in water or energy use or circularity. And then ultimately, we have to make a decision and then support the adoption of that decision. A group of NGOs, government, industry, and academics developed a set of principles to guide the alternatives assessment process. Ultimately, alternatives assessment is action-oriented. We do alternatives assessment when a decision to substitute a particular chemical of concern has been made. So alternatives assessment guides that action-oriented process where we want to reduce the hazards of chemicals, we want to minimize potential exposures and use the best available information, but because of some of the assumptions and data gaps, we want to have transparency about the decisions and how we make those decisions. And ultimately, there will be trade-offs between options, and we want to understand those trade-offs and minimize those trade-offs to the extent feasible. There are many resources available for those who are practicing alternatives assessment or those who want to support alternatives assessment efforts. Many of these are being compiled by the Swedish Center for Chemical Substitution. I'm going to go through a couple of these right now. The first is the US Department of Labor Occupational Safety and Health Administration has its toolkit for transitioning to safer chemicals, which provides a process, resources, and steps for small and medium-sized companies to support their substitution processes. It contains links to available resources. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has its Substitution and Alternatives Assessment Toolkit, and that has numerous tools as well as guidance documents and other information and case studies to support the substitution process. A new resource or a renewed resource is Subsport Plus, hosted by the German Occupational Health Authority, BAWA. This tool has access to case studies, tools to support the alternatives assessment and substitution process, as well as tools to support decision-making when safer alternatives aren't available and it is necessary to institute risk management measures in a company. Now I'm going to focus for a minute on the tools for hazard assessment, which is what the next presentation will go into deeper detail on. First of all, there are tools that can help those who are seeking better alternatives with those who make those alternatives. One particularly important resource is ChemSec's Marketplace, which is almost a dating site for safer chemicals. The US NGO Green Blue has a tool called Clean Ingredients, which is a list of chemical ingredients for formulated products, for example, cleaning products, that have met the US EPA standard for safer chemicals. Most firms start with restricted and preferred substances lists. The SIN list, hosted by ChemSec, is one list that's used by many companies to understand what chemicals to avoid in their products. While it doesn't help them to understand what product chemicals they should use, it provides that indicator of what to avoid. There are sector-based lists, for example, the Global Automotive Declarable List for the automobile sector, but there are also positive lists. The US EPA has a safer chemical ingredient list, which is a list of chemical ingredients for particular chemical functions, for example, solvents and surfactants, that meet EPA's criteria for safer chemistry. There are tools that help companies to understand and categorize the hazards of chemicals. Some of those include the Green Screen List Translator, which uses authoritative government lists to understand chemicals to avoid or which ones may be safer. PRIO, a tool that's just been updated by Chemi in Sweden, has a number of tools to be able to assess chemical hazards. And there are other private sector tools as well. There are also comparative assessment tools that help you to compare chemicals and then make a decision. The most notable of those is the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, hosted by the US NGO Clean Production Action. And then lastly, there are many data sets hosted by ECHA, the OECD, and others that either help you get access to actual in vitro and in vivo toxicological data, or ways to predict that data based on structure-activity relationships. So the key steps to evaluating the hazards of alternatives are, first, define what hazards to consider. Those are often determined by market or regulatory priorities. So once we understand what hazards we need to consider, for example, if we're eliminating chemical from a product that is a potential hormone disruptor, we may want to consider hormone disrupting chemicals in our alternatives. Next, we use restricted substances lists and authoritative lists to identify problem alternatives. So we want to screen out potentially problematic alternatives by using lists of chemicals of concern. Once we've screened those out, we can use data sources such as safety data sheets and GHS categories to review additional hazards for those chemicals that may not be on authoritative lists. Then we use various tools to compare our alternatives and categorize them as high, medium, low for different endpoints. And we consider data gaps because there's always going to be data gaps. So we want to understand whether those data gaps may have a negative influence in our decision-making process. We've done some training videos for ECHA that are on the ECHA website that walk you through this process in greater detail. As co-director of the Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Institute, we have a number of tools and approaches to support the alternatives assessment and adoption process. The Massachusetts Toxics Use Reduction Act requires manufacturing firms to every year understand their material throughput or to quantify their chemical use and how those chemicals are converted into product, waste, or emissions. And every 2 years, they have to do an analysis of alternatives to reduce their use of toxic chemicals. They pay a fee on chemicals that funds the the regulatory program, as well as a voluntary technical assistance program and a research and education institute at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. So we have a number of activities underway that help support the evaluation and adoption of safer alternatives. We train professionals on chemical hazard performance and cost assessment and provide them tools. We bring companies together to solve common toxics problems that in a pre-competitive manner. We do actual alternatives assessments to common uses of toxic chemicals in Massachusetts, and we fund research and adoption of safer and effective alternatives, often when there aren't better alternatives available. I'm going to go through one set of tools we use to identify and assess safer alternatives to solvents and other ingredients in cleaning products. So we have 3 steps. We have a tool called Cleaner Solutions to identify safer cleaning part solutions. We have a set of databases to identify and evaluate the hazards. And then we have a tool for comparing those alternatives. So Cleaner Solutions database helps you to understand what alternatives may be available based on the particular cleaning part you're trying to do, the substrate, and the equipment you're using. So all of those, and then it finds the alternatives. P2 Oasis is the tool once you have some alternatives and you've developed your data to be able to understand the hazards of those alternatives and compare them. So P2 Oasis uses a scoring summary to create a data point for decision making to compare alternatives. And it looks at various categories of impacts from a chemical, from acute human effects to chronic human effects, ecological hazards, process factors, and life cycle factors. The assessor then inputs as much information as possible, and those data points are converted into scores. The worst score for any given category drives the assessment. Ultimately, you end up with a matrix like this, where you have a score for each category of effect for each option, and you can weight those scores. For example, if carcinogenicity and human health impacts are a high concern for these alternatives, you can weight those higher. If ecological hazards are a greater concern, you can weight those higher. But what it does is it gives you a matrix to compare what you might be trading off between alternatives. So in conclusion, practitioners need to have simple but consistent processes to support identifying and evaluating safer options. There's a need for tools for practitioners with actionable information, not just lots of data, but information they can use to make more informed decisions about alternatives. Most firms need some type of technical support to identify and evaluate options, but also to connect with peers and potential solutions providers. And ultimately, if the goal is to reduce the use of toxic chemicals, we need to support the supply side of those chemicals and the adoption side, not just prohibit dangerous chemicals, but support the adoption of better chemistry. And this is a great role for the Swedish Center for Chemical Substitution. And here are some of the alternatives assessment resources we have, and you can find those having great access to opportunities for you, and my contact information. Thank you.